At dinner, Dad roared, "I'm proud of all my kids except this loser at the table." Everyone burst out laughing, so I stood up, threw a secret package on the table and said, "This is for you, Dad, happy Father's Day." I walked out, grabbed the keys to my luxury car and handed them to him. A minute later he screamed when he saw what was inside. Ethan gripped the envelope so tight his knuckles went white. God, his palms were sweating like he was 16 again, asking Jenny Morrison to prom. The risk was way higher than teenage heartbreak. The dining room hummed with that familiar soundtrack. Michael bragging about some real estate deal, Sarah name-dropping judges she'd had lunch with, David going on about hospital politics. Mom's pot roast smelled amazing, as always, but his stomach was doing backflips. At 32, he should have been past caring what Dad thought. Should have been. But here he was, clutching secrets that could change everything, waiting for the perfect moment to drop them like a bomb on Sunday dinner. Richard held court at the head of the table like some kind of suburban king. His chest puffed up every time one of the other kids mentioned money or success or whatever. When Michael talked numbers, Dad's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Sarah's courtroom victories got the approving nod, the one Ethan remembered from Little League games he was never good enough at. But when those same eyes landed on him, ice cold, dead fish stare, the look that said disappointment in capital letters. Ethan had gotten used to it over the years. But tonight? Tonight was different. Tonight he had ammunition. The envelope crinkled in his lap. Just paper and ink, really, but it might as well have been dynamite. Mom bustled in with the roast, all smiles and maternal pride. Patricia Thompson, peacekeeper extraordinaire, always trying to smooth things over between her husband and youngest son. She'd given up years ago, though. You could see it in the way she avoided eye contact when Dad got mean. The usual Father's Day routine kicked off. Each kid took their turn kissing Dad's ass, sharing their latest wins. Michael's real estate empire, Sarah's partnership track, David's fancy hospital title, the whole dog and pony show. Ethan stayed quiet, fingers drumming against the hidden envelope. His mouth felt dry as sand, but his mind was crystal clear. Time to flip the script. Richard raised his glass, face flushed with that particular brand of paternal smugness. His gaze swept the table, lingering on each golden child before landing on Ethan with pure disgust. The words that came next hit like a slap across the face. But honestly, Ethan had been expecting them for years. "I'm proud of all my kids except this loser at the table." Cue the nervous laughter, Sarah's fake giggle, Michael's smirk, David suddenly fascinated by his mashed potatoes. Mom went pale but stayed silent. Story of her life. Same old dance, same old humiliation. Except this time, Ethan didn't shrink. This time, he stood up. The chair scraped against hardwood as Ethan rose. Funny how the room went dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. His family stared like he'd grown a second head. Standing up to Dad wasn't in the playbook, never had been. But something had shifted inside him. Maybe it was the months of physical therapy. Maybe it was finally being done with active duty. Maybe he was just tired of being everyone's punching bag. He placed the envelope on the table with the kind of careful precision they'd taught him in the service. His voice came out steady, controlled. "This is for you, Dad. Happy Father's Day." Without waiting for the inevitable explosion, Ethan headed for the door. Behind him, confused murmurs started up. Dad was probably staring at that envelope like it might bite him. Mom was doing her worried hand-wringing thing. The Golden children were exchanging their usual "what's wrong with our weird brother" looks. Ethan dug into his pocket and pulled out his car keys. Not just any keys. The keys to his black BMW, the one that had taken him 3 years of saving to buy. The car Dad had admired exactly once, in that backhanded way of his. The metal felt warm in his palm. 3 years of work, 3 years of pride, about to become someone else's problem. The keys hit the table with a sharp clink that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. Richard's eyebrows shot up, confusion replacing the usual disdain. Why would his loser son be giving away his most valuable possession? "Car's yours now," Ethan said simply. Mom gasped like she'd been slapped. She knew what that BMW meant to him, knew about the overtime shifts and the careful budgeting, knew he'd been prouder of that car than anything else in his civilian life. Richard's fingers hovered over the envelope like it might explode. Smart man. In a way, it would. Ethan made it halfway to the door before Dad's voice stopped him cold. There was something different in the tone. Less certainty. More fear. Richard was peeling back the envelope seal with shaking hands, and even from across the room, Ethan could see the exact moment his father's world started to crumble. The first document was official letterhead, Department of Defense seal gleaming under the dining room lights. Richard's face went from confusion to shock, to something that looked like terror. His lips moved as he read, but no sound came out. Mom crept closer, reading over his shoulder. Her gasp was audible this time. Military commendations don't lie. Neither do classified mission reports or medals of valor. Richard's hands trembled as he flipped through page after page of his son's real life, the life he'd dismissed as worthless for 5 long years. Exceptional service, national security, classified operations, words that didn't fit with the narrative Richard had built about his youngest son. The businessman, the lawyer, the hospital administrator, none of them had ever risked their lives for strangers. None of them had ever put country before self. But Ethan had. For 5 years, while Dad called him a failure, Ethan had been serving in ways that would give most people nightmares. More documents scattered across Mom's good china. Photographs of Ethan in dress uniform, receiving honors from generals Richard recognized from news broadcasts. Citations for bravery that read like something out of an action movie. Official letters praising his unwavering dedication and extraordinary sacrifice. The BMW keys suddenly felt heavy as lead in Richard's palm. The car wasn't just transportation. It was proof of a salary he'd never understood, benefits from a job he'd never acknowledged, success he'd been too blind to see. His golden children had never saved lives. His loser son had made it his career. Patricia moved closer, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the truth. Her baby boy, the one she'd worried about through years of mysterious absences and vague explanations, was a genuine American hero. All those times he'd disappeared for months, all those phone calls that went straight to voicemail, all those evasive answers about his government job. The siblings finally gathered around, craning their necks to see what had destroyed their father's composure. Michael's face went white when he saw the photos. Sarah's mouth fell open. David just stared, speechless for maybe the first time in his life. The final document was dated 6 months ago, a medical discharge summary that made Richard's blood run cold. Shrapnel wounds, months of rehabilitation, psychological counseling. The failure he'd mocked at every family gathering was actually a wounded warrior coming home to heal. The letter explained why Ethan's service had remained classified, why his family could never know the truth. It also mentioned his request for desk duty, his desire to finally have normal relationships with his loved ones. But there was a bitter irony in the timing. His cover was blown, just as his father had delivered the most devastating insult yet. Richard's throat closed up as he tried to call out, but the front door was already slamming shut. His son was gone, walking away with his secrets and his pain and his undeserved forgiveness. The documents told a story that made Richard's other children's achievements look like participation trophies. Courage, honor, sacrifice, words that actually meant something, unlike the corporate ladder climbing and social status games the rest of his kids played. And he called this man, this hero, a loser, in front of everyone. The BMW keys burned in his palm like they were on fire. Through the dining room window, Richard watched his youngest son disappear into the suburban darkness. Ethan walked with the measured pace of someone who'd made peace with his decision. No looking back, no hesitation, just the quiet dignity of a man who'd finally spoken his truth. The family stood frozen around the scattered documents, each lost in their own thoughts. Michael looked sick. Sarah was crying quietly. David kept shaking his head like he couldn't process what he'd learned. Mom broke the silence first. "We have to find him," she whispered. But they all knew it was probably too late. Hours later, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of Ethan receiving a medal from a three-star general. His son looked older in the picture, marked by experiences Richard couldn't begin to imagine. But the smile was pure Ethan, the same grin he'd worn as a kid, bringing home good report cards that Richard had somehow stopped noticing. The house felt wrong now, like a puzzle with a missing piece. The other kids had gone home to their perfect lives, probably lying awake wondering how they'd missed something this big. Mom had retreated with a box of old photos. Richard picked up his phone and dialed Ethan's number, straight to voicemail. He tried again and again. Finally, he left a message, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Son, God, I'm so sorry. Please come home. Please let me try to fix this. But even as he spoke the words, Richard knew some things couldn't be fixed with apologies. Some damage cut too deep. Some words, once spoken, poisoned everything they touched. His greatest failure wasn't in business or marriage or parenting the others. It was in failing to see the hero who'd been sitting at his table all along. The next morning brought no answers. Ethan's apartment manager said he'd moved out 2 weeks ago. No forwarding address. His phone went straight to some generic voicemail message. Even his old friends from high school had no idea where he'd gone. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, which, Richard realized with growing horror, was probably exactly what Ethan had been trained to do. Disappearing was part of his skill set. And Richard had given him every reason to use it. Patricia found him in the garage, staring at the BMW like it held answers. "We'll find him," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Weeks turned into months. Private investigators hit dead ends. Military contacts politely declined to provide information. The other siblings launched their own searches through social media and professional networks, but came up empty-handed. The BMW sat untouched in the garage, gathering dust like a monument to Richard's mistakes. He couldn't bring himself to drive it, couldn't even look at it without feeling sick. Every Tuesday, he drove past Ethan's old apartment building, hoping for a miracle that never came. The family dinners continued, but the laughter felt forced now. Everyone pretended things were normal, but they all felt the absence. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a phone call that changed everything. Patricia picked up on the third ring, expecting another telemarketer. Instead, she heard a voice she'd been praying to hear for months. "Mom? It's me." Ethan's voice sounded different, calmer somehow, like he'd found some kind of peace. They talked for 20 minutes, mostly small talk, dancing around the elephant in the room. Finally, he asked the question that mattered. "Is Dad ready to listen? Really listen this time?" Patricia looked through the kitchen window at Richard, who was staring at that damn BMW again. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I think he finally is." The drive to Colorado took Richard 8 hours, but it felt like the longest journey of his life. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say 1,000 times, but every word sounded hollow and inadequate. How do you apologize for years of blindness? How do you take back words that cut to the bone? Ethan's house sat on a quiet street in Denver, modest but well-maintained, the kind of place where a man could disappear from his old life and build something new. Richard sat in his rental car for 10 minutes, gathering courage he'd never needed in any boardroom or business deal. When he finally knocked, his hands were shaking worse than a leaf in a thunderstorm. The door opened, and there was Ethan, looking older, calmer, somehow more solid than Richard remembered. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked like cautious hope. They stood there for a moment, father and son, separated by years of hurt and misunderstanding. "Dad." Ethan's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "Son." Richard's voice cracked like he was going through puberty again. Can we talk?" Ethan stepped aside, gesturing him into a living room that was neat, simple, peaceful, military precision mixed with civilian comfort. Photos on the mantel showed places Richard didn't recognize, people he'd never met, a whole life he'd been excluded from. They sat across from each other on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them feeling like a canyon. Richard had planned this conversation, scripted it out, But now that he was here, all his prepared words evaporated. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate and massive at the same time. "About everything. About you. I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, but it's all I've got." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying his father's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but tired. "Why now, Dad? What changed?" Richard struggled to find words that weren't complete garbage. "I lost my son," he said finally. "The real one. Turns out I never knew him at all." They talked until the sun went down. Really talked. Maybe for the first time in decades. Richard learned about missions he'd never imagined. About sacrifices that put his own problems in perspective. Ethan learned about a father's fear of showing weakness. About pride that had curdled into something toxic. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. When Richard finally left, they shook hands at the door, and for the first time in years, his son looked him in the eye.